Well, unlike my colleagues, I need props, so I'm going to use slides, and I'm actually going to follow up a little bit on David's comments. My job to you today is to talk to you about the relationship between emotion and pain. So David, where David left off, I think, is a great segue into this topic. To understand the link between emotion and pain, there are a couple of things that you need to know, and the most important thing that you need to know is that your brain, as David was pointing out, is the architect of your experience, that the neurons in your brain don't lie dormant, passively waiting to be stimulated by information in the world that you will then react to. Instead, the neurons in your brain are active even when sensory input isn't there. So this is called intrinsic activity, and really understanding intrinsic activity is the key not only to understanding the nature of emotion, but also to understanding the nature of pain and to understanding the link between them. Your brain's job is to try to figure out what to do from one moment to the next, how to act to keep you alive and well. And to do this, it has to figure out what is going on in the outside world. This is a really hard job because for your entire life, your brain is basically entombed in a dark, silent box called the skull. And it has to learn what's going on in the world only indirectly via the scraps of incomplete information that it receives from the sensory channels of the body, that is, the sights and sounds and smells and touches and tastes that it receives from the end organs of the body's sensors, the eyes, the ears, the nose, and so on. And so from your brain's perspective, your body is just another part of the world that it has to figure out what's going on in there, right? So from your brain's perspective, your body is sending sensory input, and your brain has to figure out what that sensory input means, what it refers to. So you have sensations from your heart that's pumping, your lungs are expanding, you have inflammatory processes going on, there are metabolic processes going on. And so your brain's trying to figure out what causes these sensations so that it can understand what it needs to do to cope with them. The problem is that all of this sensory input is noisy, it's ambiguous, it's incomplete. So any given sensation, a flash of light, a sound, an ache, a cramp, can have many different causes, and your brain has to figure out what the cause is only by having the effect, the sensation itself. And it has one other set of information that it can draw on, and that is memories. That is, past experiences that it has stored in its vast network of connections. These memories represent what caused the sensations the last time you were in a situation that was just like the one that you're in right now, and what actions worked best to cope with those sensations in that situation. Scientists now believe, and there's pretty good evidence, that your brain is using this stored knowledge about past experience to predict incoming sensory information from the world as a way of explaining them. So your brain's basically constantly making predictions about what sensations are going to happen in the next moment before the sensations actually reach the brain. That's the general idea. So sensory neurons in the brain, as a form of intrinsic activity, are firing before they actually receive information. So right at this very moment in time, your brain is anticipating what sensory input it's going to receive in the next moment. That's how you can understand the words that I'm saying right now. So a prediction means that your brain is beginning to construct your experience. The experience is the conscious, subjective experience that you have, even before it's receiving sensations from the world, just a moment before. That's the general idea. So here's a little mind experiment, a thought experiment to help you understand this. Can anybody tell me what this is? Strawberry ice cream, yes, indeed. And if you were to taste this strawberry ice cream, how would it taste to you, assuming you liked strawberry ice cream? Wonderful and delicious.
Cold.
And if you were expecting strawberry ice cream, but you were in a restaurant that was owned by Heston Blumenthal, and he served you this ice cream, and you placed it in your mouth, and it turned out to be salmon ice cream, how do you think it would taste to you? Horrible. It would taste horrible. So all of you have had the experience of putting something in your mouth and tasting something that was other than what you expected, and having that shock of realization that this is not what you expected. That's because the neurons in your brain were already firing, anticipating the taste before the food even was placed in your mouth. And in fact, Blumenthal, the chef, did some experiments with some psychologists where, in fact, they took his ice cream, his salmon ice cream, and gave it to some subjects who were expecting it to taste like salmon. Actually, they told subjects that it was going to taste like salmon mousse, and the subjects loved it. But when they told subjects that they would be eating a strawberry ice cream, the subjects hated the taste, right? So the idea being that even though we're mostly unaware of the fact that our brains are predicting all the time, in fact they are, and how we know is that we're rarely surprised by the sensory inputs that we receive. Not to say that we're never surprised, but we're rarely surprised, right? So this is just one example of that. Prediction, I think, helps us understand the connection between emotion and pain. So I'll just give you another example that's specific to that topic. If you imagine that you're at the doctor's office for a routine physical, and the doctor informs you that you're going to receive an injection, immediately what happens is that the limbic regions in your brain, which I've depicted here in blue, this is a medial slice of the brain. So if you took the brain and you cracked it open like an egg and you were looking at one hemisphere, what you're looking at there is the inside medial wall of one hemisphere. Those regions of the brain actually start to predict the consequences of that injection and to prepare your body for action almost immediately. So the limbic cortices send signals to your heart and to your lungs. So your heart starts to beat faster, your lungs start to breathe more deeply, your muscles start to tense. These are visceral and motor changes that are starting to occur in your body. At the same time, though, exactly as these motor changes, as these limbic regions are sending the commands down to change the visceral and motor movements in your body, these same regions are projecting exactly the same information to the sensory regions of your brain very fast. So that's a lateral view of the brain. If you were looking at the side of the brain, a side of the cortex, that's what you would see. That communication is basically changing the firing of those neurons. It's telling those sensory regions, here are the sensations that you should anticipate from those motor and sensory, from those visceral changes in the body, even before those changes actually make it their way back up to the brain. So those are a set of sensory predictions that the brain is already starting to compute before the information makes its way back up to the brain. So with these sensory predictions, your brain is starting to simulate the visceral and motor sensations that it's expecting before they actually reach the brain. And you experience these as the feeling of anxiety. So in effect, you're experiencing anxiety before the actual sensory input reaches the brain. So anxiety, and in fact, most emotions work this way, we think, is your brain's best guess of what the physical changes in your body are going to feel like based on past experience in a similar situation. And we know that the experience of pain and the experience of emotion are constructed in similar brain networks, as David mentioned. So scientists are beginning to think that pain perception, because pain is a perception, just like vision is a perception, and audition is a perception, and taste is a perception, that pain perception probably works by the same predictive mechanisms as do other forms of perception, including emotion. So as you sit in the doctor's office and you're waiting for the injection, the limbic regions of your brain are predicting tissue damage from the puncture on your skin, and they begin to simulate the expected sensory changes. That is, they're predicting the sensory changes before the puncture even happens. These are called nociceptive changes, or the pain sensations from the body are being predicted by the brain. And they happen well in advance of the actual event itself. So that the pain that you feel starts to be computed in the brain even before the actual tissue damage can occur, and even before the stimulation can actually reach the brain. This is all happening in the matter of milliseconds, in the blink of an eye, so you're not going to notice consciously the change, the duration difference, but there is very, very good evidence that this is happening in most other sensory systems, and this is what scientists are now thinking also happens in the perception of pain.
About 1 more minute?
Yeah. Well, actually, Amanda told me I could go. I had a couple more minutes, so okay. I'm going to take I'm going to take 1 or 2 more minutes, but
just doing my job.
So here's, I think, the punchline. The neurons, the neural systems that modulate or control visceral changes in the body and pain transmission in the body are exactly the same. So the neural pathways, both in the body and in the brain, that are important for computing emotion and for computing pain are identical. They're not similar, they're identical. So one can modulate the other. So the visceral changes that your brain sends down to make your heart race, or to expand your lungs, or to control all the other visceral changes that are happening in your body that you experience as anxiety, these downward changes can actually reach right down, we think, into the body and ramp up the upward transmission of pain sensations to the brain. And because the cortical regions are identical where pain is experienced, emotion can turn up the dial on the experience of pain or turn down the dial, depending on the relationship. And presumably this can even happen in the absence of any pain transmission itself, as in the case of chronic pain. So scientists are now exploring whether chronic pain and other emotional disorders, like depression, are actually just bad predictions that go uncorrected. So there are a number of reasons why the brain would make bad predictions. And I realize that what I'm suggesting here is somewhat controversial, so I want to repeat what I'm suggesting here really carefully so that I'm not misinterpreted. I'm suggesting that chronic pain uses the same brain and body pathways as the circuitry for emotion, and actually also for the circuitry for stress, and actually a number of other phenomena as well, which I could show you images for. And there are other biological mechanisms that these share as well that we haven't really talked about. For example, high levels of inflammation and other types of metabolic disruptions that occur in these phenomena as well. So from a biological perspective, the machinery is very similar in emotion, in emotional disorders, in stress, in chronic pain. I'm not saying that chronic pain is just emotion and therefore is all in your head, as if pain were imaginary. I think everybody here realizes that chronic pain sufferers are told such things all the time and that it's incredibly insulting when you're living with pain for other people to tell you that you're just imagining it. But what I am saying is that chronic pain, like all perception and emotion, is a perception. And perception is in your brain. It's not, your brain is constructing perception. Perception is not a passive experience that you're not passively receiving information from the world. The brain actively constructs perceptions, sometimes even without the stimulation from the world, as in the example of people who have amputations, for example. So it's very possible that, in fact, likely, that people with chronic pain are feeling extreme pain in the absence of nociception, and that that they're experiencing, the experiences they have are being caused by processes that are highly similar to the way that emotions are constructed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're crazy or that their experiences are invalid. It just means that, if you believe that, it just means that there's a misunderstanding about how normal perception is constructed.
So I think we're getting close to another minute.
And we're done.
Okay.
And that's it.
Great.